I'd like to talk about states' rights, and I know that there are an awful lot of them, and an awful lot of them in dispute, but I'm going to go with my top 3 hits here. The first major one, obviously, slavery. Now, the abolitionist movement and the free soil movement, which I'll talk about in a bit, had taken hold in the North and was creeping south. Now, the rich white men in the South, who were the ones who owned slaves, didn't want slavery abolished because it supported their luxurious and leisurely lifestyle, and they wanted to keep it that way. Now, they knew that they couldn't take their normal arguments of black people are animals, or slavery is in the Bible, to Washington or to the northern states and try to gather support. So they settled for states' rights. They said Washington has no right to tell us what to do. Now, its relevance to today is obvious, but there are some things that may not be quite as obvious. Most of the people in the South were not rich white people. They were poor white people. They were plantation owners and big farm owners, businessmen, bankers, and then the rest of them were pretty much poor people, white or black. Now, these poor people, a lot of them belonged to the free soil movement, and some were actually anti-slavery, but the free soil movement was a movement that was anti-slavery, not on moral grounds, but because they said that slaves were taking jobs away from real Americans. Does that sound familiar? Deja vu. So how did these rich white guys convince these poor white men and boys to go fight for them? And I know, for you Civil War scholars, a lot of them didn't volunteer, but a lot of them did. Well, they convinced them that if they didn't stop Washington from coming down there and telling them that they couldn't have slaves, that the next thing you know, that Big Brother socialism, I didn't have those terms then, but they would have used them had they had them, but Washington would be telling them what job they could have, who they could marry. They'd make people marry goats. So they got the population stirred up, thinking that Washington was going to come in and run every aspect of their lives if they didn't stop them now. Does this sound familiar? More deja vu already. It's sort of a reverse deja vu. Okay, so that was it. The interesting thing about this was that when they decided to go to war, they appointed Jefferson Davis as their president, and the Davis administration wanted to institute taxes and conscription to provide money and manpower for the war. Now, everybody thinks that the North won the war, and they did for a large proportion because they had a much higher population, they had a much bigger industrial base, they had more money, they had more resources. But part of it was that these southern states, who were so fired up about states' rights, didn't want to provide taxes or soldiers to Jefferson Davis because it violated their states' rights. So not only were they overwhelmed population-wise and resource-wise, but they were completely disorganized. You know, this is why so many Southern soldiers went to war without the proper equipment, or weaponry or shoes or whatever. So they wanted states' rights bad enough to fight for them, but they weren't willing, and they were willing to start a war over it, but they weren't willing to pay for the war. Now, does this strike anybody as a bit of deja vu, reverse deja vu, when G.W. Bush started 2 wars and then lowered taxes? He wanted his war, he didn't want to pay for it.